This portrait of Charles and the next portrait of Nancy are heirlooms that are presently in the possession of Mary Fuller. They are in the process of being passed to James Dayton. This is Nancy Goodnow Dayton. The obituary of Nancy Dayton appears in the March 21st, 1883 edition of the Saratoga Journal. It reads, Mrs. Charles Dayton, living on Hadley Hill, a lady upwards of 40 years of age, whose husband died last September, fell to the floor dead on Saturday evening after doing her usual Saturday's work. She leaves 5 children. Charles and Nancy's graves and monument are found in the Dean Cemetery off the Stony Creek Road, just west of the Harris Cemetery on the south side of the road. Their oldest child, Delbert, traveled to Hadley sometime between 1910 and 1915 for the purpose of placing this monument on their unmarked graves. Delbert, the oldest sibling of Wilbur Thomas Dayton, was born in September 26, 1858, in Hadley. His wife, Alice C. McCarty, was born in Village Creek, Iowa, November 2, 1860. They were married November 7, 1888. They were married in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, November 7, 1888. They had one child, Ida Alice Dayton, who never married. Delbert became a trolley car conductor in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. James Warren Dayton was born on Hadley Hill in 1862. He remained a bachelor his whole life. He stayed with Wilbur on the farm until 1916. When his sister Jenny's husband died, she went to Greenwich to live with her and help her on her farm. He lived there until his death in 1933. Wilbur's sister Jenny was born August 8, 1866 in Hadley. At some time after her parents died, Jenny went to live with her Aunt Arinda Dayton Roberson in Greenwich. There she found her husband, Thomas Roach. A big highlight in the year was going to Aunt Jenny's in Greenwich, New York, about 35 miles from Corinth. Jenny had several cherry trees, and they yielded a large harvest. Flossie says, I remember a trip to Greenwich to visit Dad's other sister, Jenny Dayton Roach, and her husband Tom. We took this trip while we were living on Pine Street the first time. Dad, Mother, Charles, Chester, and I took the bus to Saratoga Springs, where we boarded another bus that took us to Schuylerville. Then we walked about 2 miles, crossing the Hudson River to Thompson. From there, a trolley took us to Greenwich. Then we walked 2 miles to Aunt Jenny's farm. My new shoes skinned my heels, so I took them off and walked with bare feet.
For chicken. Aunt Jenny was famous for ginger snaps. And I remember I used to go in those front rooms down to Aunt Jenny's, and she had some books, great big thick books about World War I. And I used to admire those. Sea battles and so forth, you know.
Carrie was the youngest of the 5 children. She was 11 when she became an orphan. It is speculated that at some point she went to live with her brother in Iowa, since her husband D. Harris was born and lived in Iowa. They were married in Greenfield, New York, August 12, 1892. They had one child, Ernest, who drowned in the Sacandaga River when he was only 16 years old. Flossie says, occasionally Dad would hitch up the horse and take us up to West Day to visit his sister Carrie and her husband Dee Harris. Aunt Carrie wouldn't sit down to eat until everyone was served. She would insist that you put plenty of homemade butter on those delicious pancakes and then pour on the maple syrup. Her neighbors were impressed by her gas refrigerator. That was before electrification reached their rural area. I was impressed by the Victrola and the Uncle Josh records. The separator amazed me too. Uncle D would come from the barn with the milk, pour it in the top of the separator, and turn the crank. Cream and milk would come out of the separate spouts. Aunt Carrie raised colts and helped with the barn chores. I thought it was strange to see her wearing men's shoes. Paul says that it was a real thrill to come home from church on Sunday and see his Uncle D. Harris's car in the driveway.
Remember Aunt Carrie liked the horses, dog.
Did you ever visit her place up there?
Oh yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, about the first thing that stands out is the first time, my first acquaintance with soda pop. She went down cellar and brought back a bunch of bottles in some kind of a tub. And we had soda, and I don't know if I've ever had soda before. And she was famous for chicken.
Now let's return to Nancy Dayton for a moment so we can take a look at her Goodnow bloodline. Nancy Goodnow, Charles Dayton's wife, was the 8th generation of Goodnows on the American soil. The Goodnows were of English descent. Nancy's parents divorced in 1861 after having 12 children and celebrating over 30 years of marriage. Thomas Goodnow left his wife Lucy for Jane Flanders, a woman 25 years younger than him. Lucy's divorce settlement is on file at the county court building in Ballston, New York. She received a settlement of $1.50 per week plus $50 per year for life. Lucy went to live with a daughter after her divorce. Her gravestone reads, "Former wife of Thomas Goodnow." A different Thomas Goodnow was the American patriarch of the Goodnow family. He was born about 1608 in Shaftesbury, Wiltshire, England. He immigrated from London to Marlborough, Massachusetts in 1638 aboard the English ship the Confidence. He was a Marlborough selectman 1661 to 1662 and in 1664. He was also a guard of the fence, commissioned to build a bridge across the Sudbury River, and he was a surveyor of the highways. 5 generations later, sometime during the 1820s, Stephen Goodnow became the first Goodnow in Athol, the early name of Stony Creek, New York. As mentioned earlier, Lucy Harris was the mother of Nancy Goodnow Dayton. Here are a couple of views of Lucy dating from about the time of her divorce from husband Thomas. In Edith Haskell's correspondence to Flossie Denton, she refers to Lucy as a very gentle and sweet woman, although these pictures depict her as a very stern and melancholy person. Lucy was the 6th generation of American Harrises in her branch. Thomas was the patriarch of the American Harrises in Lucy's line. He was born about 1590 in Hatherop, England. He died in 1634 at the age of 44, only 4 years after immigrating to America. He was admitted as a freeman May 18, 1631. He was a ferryman between Winnesimmett and Charlton, and from Winnesimmett to Boston. Ebenezer relocated from Ipswich, Massachusetts to Plainfield, Connecticut in 1702. He was a farmer with significant property holdings. He married Christabel Crary. The Crary family was very affluent and were early settlers of the town of Plainfield. Ebenezer was a member of the First Congregational Church of Plainfield and had in his possession a Bible and several divinity books. He possessed carpentry skills, which led to a tragic accident on June 28, 1728, in Norwich. A pamphlet written in August of 1728 describes the incident. A considerable number of men in the place were raising a cart bridge about 20 feet high and about 250 feet long over the Shattucket River. A principal piece of timber which lay in the foundation gave way, flung the whole bridge for 100 feet in length to the ground, with near 40 men upon it. 2 men were killed and many wounded. Among the most considerably wounded were Lieutenant Samuel Butts, Ebenezer Harris, and Josiah Butts, known to have been from Plainfield. Ebenezer must have recovered from his injuries, since he lived another 22 years after this accident. This concludes the review of the ancient Daytons and associated lines. Now let's take a look at Wilbur Dayton Sr. in more depth. Wilbur Dayton was born the 4th of 5 children of Charles and Nancy Dayton. He was born in 1870. He died at the age of 86. Wilbur lived in a simple and somewhat meager life. We don't know much of his early life, even though 2 of his children have been interviewed. We know that he was orphaned at the age of 13 and that he took over running of the family farm at this young age. Flossie says, "I have heard Dad say there were times when he did not go to Sunday school because he had no shoes. It was not easy for these teenagers to make a living on the rough Dayton farm." His eldest brother Delbert left the simple life on Hadley Hill for greener pastures in Iowa. Jenny moved to Greenwich, New York to live with her aunt Orinda Dayton Roberson, and she found her husband Thomas Roach there. Carrie went to Iowa at the same point. While there, she met her husband D. Harris. After the wedding, they moved to Hadley and settled in the town of Day. Only his brother Jim stayed behind with the teenage Wilbur and helped him work the farm. Just imagine a 13-year-old boy and his 21-year-old brother working a farm and tending to all the household chores, including cooking, cleaning, and washing. Wilbur never had much of a chance to enjoy the carefree teenage years. Wilbur quit school in the 7th grade. Wilbur Jr. says that Dad took advantage of the school system until in the 7th grade he ran out of the part of the arithmetic book that the teacher could handle. When she turned back to the earlier part of the book, he figured he had better use of his time. Wilbur Jr. eloquently explains his dad's meager work of life. He says, "Farming and cutting wood were natural things for people who didn't have time or inclination to escape the hard work that they grew up with. So Dad sharpened his skills and worked real hard to make out with thrift to get ahead as he could, and the cash crop was cutting wood. After he'd get up and do the chores, he'd wade through the snow with his double-bladed axe to a woodlot and cut down and cut up the wood in 4-foot lengths, split and piled in 4-by-8-foot piles. Then he'd hurry back through the snow to do the evening chores. If he had good luck, he probably made 50 cents for his day's work. Some of the money he later gave to help my education and probably saved from his wood cutting." Jessie White married Wilbur Dayton, who had proposed to her when she was 18 years of age. At that time, she had not been willing to settle down. However, at age 24, she concluded that he was the nicest guy that had courted her. After the wedding at her parents' home on the Lawton Place, she accompanied the groom to the Dayton homestead, where he had been keeping bachelor hall with his brother Jim. That was August 31st, 1904. After the wedding, Jim took the land on the opposite side of the road and lived alone in a small one-room house. Wilbur and Jessie had 5 children. Since they moved often, each child was born in a different house. Both worked extremely hard to make a comfortable home for their family. They cooperated in fixing up and papering and painting the various properties that they occupied. Wilbur married Jessie at her parents' home, the Lawton Place near Madison. Wilbur and Jessie started married life at the Henry Dayton Place on Hadley Hill. They lived there for about 3 years. Flossie Gertrude Dayton was born there in July 1905. They were living in the Morton House in Luzerne, where Charles Alexander was born in May 1908. The Morton House is located over the Big Rock on Main Street. They moved to the Lawton Place, where Chester Arthur was born in January 1910. From there, they moved to Pine Street, Corinth. Wilbur bought 3 contiguous lots, each 50 feet by 150 feet, on top of the hill at the lower end of Pine Street. He built a small barn in which they lived for several weeks in 1912 while the house was being built. Elon Smith built the house following a blueprint drawn by Jessie. Wilbur painted it pearl gray. The house stands at the top of the hill on the right side of Pine Street as one travels from the mill toward the outskirts of the village. In September 1914, they moved to the Shorey's farm on Angel Road. In March 1915, they moved to the Galley Place on Hadley Hill. There, Wilbur Thomas Jr. was born in October 1916. In the summer of 1918, they lived in the tenant house on the Ripley Place, formerly known as the Kennedy Place. In September 1918, they repossessed the house on Pine Street and moved back to it so that Flossie could attend high school. In 1920, they moved to 11 Mechanic Street, Corinth, where Wilbur and Jessie lived until after his death in 1957.